Good evening, everyone. Myself, Dr. Sharath Babuke, Associate Professor in the Department of Otorhinolaryngology, Gadag Institute of Medical Science, Gadag. On behalf of our entire ENT team, I welcome you all to this brainstorming online CME. I welcome Dr. P.S. Boosreddy, our beloved Director, sir, Dr. Raju GM, our Principal, sir, Dr. Rajshekar Megeri, Medical Superintendent, Dr. G.S. Palled, District Surgeon. I welcome you all, sir, to this live session. I welcome Dr. Manjunath Dandi, who is our today's honorable guest speaker and is going to enlighten us on contemporary management of allergic rhinitis. Dr. Manjunath sir is a very well-known and one of the most distinguished doctors in India. He needs no introduction, yet the occasion demands. Here it is in brief. Dr. Manjunath D is a consultant ENT surgeon and lateral skull base surgeon, presently working as associate professor in the Department of ENT at Karnataka Institute of Medical Science, Hubli, Karnataka. After pursuing his post-graduation in MS ENT, Sir has done fellowship in lateral skull base surgery at Grupo Otologico during 2015 to 17. During this fellowship period, he has worked under renowned Dr. Maria Sanna. His area of interest are lateral and anterior skull base surgery. Sir has secured Tata Endowment Scholarship during 2014 to 16. Sir has received many awards, to name them Dr. P. N. Berry Award for Fellowship in Otology and Lateral Skull Base in UK. He has received Young Scientific Award from Development of Science and Technology in the year 2011. He has more than 20 publications in international and national journal, and he has co-authored textbook on instruments in ENT. Let me not take your time, sir. I request Dr. Manjunath, sir, to take over. Thank you, sir. One more minute, sir. I'd like to give instruction to the audience. Audience, like during this session, if you are having any queries, you can text us in the chat box. At the end of the session, we are going to address your queries. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction, Dr. Sharath. It's indeed a great honor and privilege to be giving this talk on contemporary management of allergic rhinitis. I thank the director, the superintendent, the principal of Gadag Institute of Medical Sciences, and I would also thank my very close friend, Dr. Sharath, who has been instrumental in organizing this program at a very short interval of time. I thank him for organizing this program. So without wasting much of the time, there are a lot of people who are actually online as well as offline. And without wasting much time, so let me start this presentation on contemporary management of allergic rhinitis. So when we actually thought of giving this topic, our agenda was basically, so because there is an audience who are undergraduates, the postgraduates, and many of the consultants. So we thought of having a broader topic, and so we decided that the commonest topic, so day to day, so we manage is the allergic rhinitis. And there has been, this is a neglected disease, although it's such a common disease, and and still it's been neglected. And even I have seen myself many of the allergic rhinitis cases for years together. So I have seen, so they are just getting the antihistaminics, and sometimes they have been using the antihistaminics for years together. And somehow this is an area so which needs more and more people to have the knowledge about the contemporary management. So I would like to highlight on that today. In my presentation for today, so this is the basic the outline I would like to talk on: the definition and the classification of the allergic rhinitis, the epidemiology, the pathophysiology and the mechanisms, the risk factors for allergic rhinitis, how do we evaluate and diagnose cases of allergic rhinitis, so what are the associated conditions, and then the management. Okay. The allergic rhinitis is an IgE-mediated inflammatory condition. So it's resulting from allergen introduction in a sensitized individual. So what are the cardinal symptoms of allergic rhinitis? The first and the foremost is the nasal congestion, the rhinorrhea. Usually the rhinorrhea is almost very clear and watery like. Excessive sneezing. Then associated with that, the pruritus of the nose. It could be pruritus of the palate, throat, or even the ears, any of these. Area classification. So of the allergic rhinitis. So this is a newer classification. How is it classified? So it's classified as the intermittent symptoms and one with the persistent symptoms. Okay. The intermittent, when do we call it as the intermittent symptoms? So when the symptoms is less than 4 days per week, or if it is less than 4 weeks at a single time. So we usually call it as the intermittent. So we call it as persistent when it is more than 4 days per week and more than 4 weeks at a time. So or for it should be or more than 4 weeks at a time. So that's when so we call it as the persistent variety. And in each of these intermittent variety as well as the persistent variety, again, so it could be either mild variety or it could be moderate to severe variety. So when do we call it as the mild variety? When the patient is having normal sleep, the normal daily activities, is able to work normally, and the child, if it is a child, there are is regularly going to school and there are no complaints, and if there are no trouble, some symptoms, so we call it as the mild variety. So when do we call it as the moderate to severe variety? So when one or more of the following items are actually present, if the sleep is actually disturbed, so due to the allergic rhinitis, the day-to-day activities are actually affected, and the child is actually not going to the school, or the adult is not going, putting a lot of leaves. So when going to the work, and if there are troublesome symptoms, so we call it as so moderate to severe variety. Okay, there are the phenotypes of the chronic rhinitis. There are different phenotypes. So one entity is actually the allergic rhinitis. There is the other entity called as the infectious rhinitis, and the non-infectious rhinitis. And many a times all these put together, so they could be combination of both allergy, non-allergy, as well as the infections. The infectious one, so most of the times it's the rhinosinusitis. So put together, all these can be there as a combined entity. So and it is called as the mixed rhinitis. And the nasal anatomy actually influences the symptoms a lot. And in addition to the allergy, what is actually existing, the symptoms, they are actually basically determined by these factors. So what are these factors? So when we examine the nasal cavity, there is something called as a septum, so which is there. In the lateral wall, we have the turbinate. And if you go to the nasopharynx, so there could be some pathology in the nasopharynx. If we take the turbinate into consideration, the turbinate could be hypertrophied, and there could be associated concavulosa, and the septum could be deviated. So the deviated nasal septum could also pose a problem in these individuals, because the nasal cycle, during the nasal cycle, there is an alternate congestion and the decongestion phase, and because of the allergy, so there is bilaterally there could be obstruction, and this septal deviation again, it is going to affect badly, because one side the septum is deviated and the opposite side the turbinate is actually hypertrophied because of the compensatory hypertrophy. All this actually leads to increased severity. Because of the allergic rhinitis, there are a lot of secretions in the nasal cavity. The turbinates are actually congested. So patient invariably will have severe nasal obstruction. So whenever these entities are actually present. And in case of the children, if we are actually, if we consider the children, then the adenoid hypertrophy could be present, and that again can actually aggravate the allergic rhinitis. The prevalence of the allergic rhinitis globally, so it's very alarming. The WHO, this was actually published in, the data was published in 2015, although it was an earlier data of 2007. So one can actually see that the global burden of the allergic rhinitis, so it's something like 400 million people are actually affected. And if the prevalence among the adults is actually taken into consideration, the prevalence is as high as 10 to, it varies from 10 to 32%. So 10 to 32% is enormous, especially in Asia Pacific region. This is the problem situation in the world due to the allergic rhinitis. Here, if we look at it, both it's nowadays it's both asthma as well as allergic rhinitis. So it's considered as one airway, one disease. So earlier this concept wasn't there. So that's because if we take the allergic rhinitis into consideration, it occurs up to 20 to 30% of the general population. That's what I actually highlighted now. And it occurs in greater than 80% of the asthmatics. So if you take the asthma population, so if you take this circle of asthma, so one can see that about 80% of them, so they will have allergic rhinitis. So 80% is enormous percentage. Whereas, so if you take the asthma into consideration, so if you take the asthma into consideration, it occurs roughly in about 5 to 15% of the general population. And this is the allergic rhinitis square, and this is actually the asthma square. If you take the asthma square into consideration, about 40% of them, so they have allergic rhinitis. So this is the problem statement. The allergic rhinitis, it occurs in greater than 80% of the asthmatics, whereas the asthma, it occurs in up to 40% of allergic rhinitis patients. Both are actually coexisting in many of the cases. It's important that, so whenever we are treating for the allergic rhinitis, the asthma is not neglected. Similarly, vice versa. So whenever we are treating for the asthma, the allergic rhinitis should not be neglected. And both these together, they have to be treated. This is the same factors which I was actually trying to say. And here, so when one looks at it, so this is a correlation of the age with coexistence of the asthma and allergic rhinitis. So with different ages, so one looks at it. So there is if you take the 20 to 40 or 45 years into consideration, so that is actually the peak. About nearly 60% of the people, so they are in this age group. So where both asthma as well as allergic rhinitis are coexisting. Whereas in the children, so it's about if you less than 20 years, if we consider, so it's about less than 10%. and 45 to 64 years, it's about 25%, and greater than 65%, so it's about 7%. So this is it. This is the atopic march, so if we look at the different age groups of the individuals, so let's take the eczema into consideration. So the eczema is actually more common among the children. So the eczema is actually more common among the children, and as the age progresses, there are a less number of the incidence actually keeps on reducing. Whereas if the allergic rhinitis is actually considered, so you invariably, so 5 to 10 age group, so it's around 2 to 12 percent is actually the incidence, and afterwards it attains a more or less a plateau curve. Whereas if the asthma is actually considered, again, the asthma, so this is the sort of the curve one gets, and the peak is actually in the age group. So from about, even in the pediatric age group, so the asthma can actually occur. So so basically, so even in the adult population also, so there is a significant incidence of the asthma as well as asthma. Whereas the food allergy, so mainly in the younger population, the food allergy is more, and it keeps on reducing as the age progresses. This is about the atopic march. The pathophysiology of the allergic rhinitis, I don't want to go into the details of the pathophysiology, but there is something called as a phase of sensitization. I think we all read it in the microbiology. There is a phase of sensitization and a phase of clinical disease. So in the sense, whenever the allergens are actually, presented to the antigen presenting cell, so this ultimately what happens, the IgE antibodies are actually produced. So when the next time when the allergen enters into the body, so there are various substances which are actually liberated. So which is basically responsible for sneezing, rhinorrhea, as well as congestion. So among them, so basically the histamine is so one of the important materials, so which is actually released. So which is basically responsible for the symptoms. Okay, so this is this let me united airway concept. This let me skip this. Mm, okay, so what are the risk factors for the allergic rhinitis? So what are the allergens? So the commonest is actually, some the inhaled allergens. So and then the pollens, again the pollens. So it is inhalant allergen. Then the mite, as well as the mite. So it's a very important allergen. So this mite, the dust mites, so they will be present in the blankets and the pillow covers. That is one of the reasons, so I have been asking my patients to get rid of these agents, because the inhalant, the dust is actually the commonest allergen, and these the mite allergens are also a significant entity. And fungal allergens also contribute significantly, because these molds are actually formed inside the home. So whenever there is increased humidity in the areas at home, so one can actually see these fungal allergens, and they can actually significantly cause allergy. Animal danders, so especially those who are having the pets, the animal danders also can cause the allergy. The food allergens, they are not very significant, but still the small percentage, the food allergens can actually contribute to the allergic rhinitis. Then the pollution, there are a lot of smokes which can cause the allergy. Then the tobacco and the smoke, again, so then the sibling number, so this is again, so risk factors. mainly the allergy, as one knows, the allergic rhinitis runs in the families also. So if the one individual is affected, the other individual, there is a high incidence that the other individual can also get affected in future, or they may be present together. So it's genetic. The diet, the food allergens, I have actually told about it. So these are actually the risk factors. So the important risk factors, so which causes the allergic rhinitis. The avoidance of them is very important. And this is so one of the genetics. When I was talking about the genetics, so there are about 41 loci which are actually found to be associated with allergic rhinitis, and their function is basically these 41 loci. So whatever has been identified, so their basic function is involving regulation of B cell and the T cell and the antigen recognition. So ultimately these are the areas so which are affected, and the most strong signal is actually from HLA DQB1. So this is one of the things, so you people should remember HLA DQB1. So the strong signals are from these HLA, and these can be overlapped with asthma. So these I have already told: asthma, eczema, autoimmune diseases, and non-allergic rhinitis, all can be overlapping. So because of in these individuals where there is a strong signal and these loci, so when one is able to detect, those individuals can have overlap of these diseases, and vice versa. So if a person is actually having these diseases in combination, so one has to strongly think of a strong genetic association in that particular individuals. Okay, so is there a potential protective effect on the development of allergic rhinitis? So this is a question so which is posed by many. The breastfeeding, so does it influence the development of the allergic rhinitis, the pet exposure, the microbial diversity, does this influence? The option for breastfeeding for the specific purpose of allergic rhinitis prevention. In general, breastfeeding has been strongly recommended due to the multiple beneficial effects, and some studies have even postulated that so it may be beneficial, but however the grade of the evidence is not very strong. It is grade C evidence, the grade C evidence. Whereas the pet exposure, when it is taken into consideration, so again it is the level of the evidence is C, and there is as such there is no evidence that the pet avoidance in the childhood it prevents allergic rhinitis later in the life. This association so is not there. So if an individual avoids the pet in the childhood, it doesn't mean that it should not have allergic rhinitis later in the life. But however, early pet exposure, especially dog exposure in non-allergic families early in the childhood, so this may be protective. And when one takes into the microbial diversity, the microbial diversity of the skin, airways, and the gut is important for the prevention of sensitization and allergic diseases in the population. So this is actually the level of the evidence is actually B. So there is an increased hypothesis that the the normal microbial flora, so if it is normally present, so this can actually prevent the sensitization and subsequent allergy in an individual. So this is a very important fact. The level of the evidence, only the strong evidence is for the microbial diversity. So whereas for the other two, it is although there are a lot of hypotheses, but still the level of evidence is C. The evaluation and the diagnosis. So what are the classical symptoms of allergic rhinitis? So patient comes with nasal congestion or obstruction, It may be unilateral or bilateral, or it may be alternating from one nostril to the other nostril. As I pointed out, over a period of time, there could be even nasal polyps, especially ethmoidal polyps is very commonly it is known to be associated with allergic rhinitis. So when over a period of time, many times the individual comes with the polyp itself, and there could be even the inflammatory, the other tumors or anatomical defects. So when one examines, they may be present, but the tumor is actually quite, the association is quite rare. But the presence of the anatomical defects further aggravates the nasal obstruction. The sneezing. Sneezing is very common, and it's a excessive sneezing. And each time, so one might have seen there will be about 5 to 10 sneezes. There will be continuous sneezing, especially early in the morning. The rhinorrhea, it's watery in color, and if sometimes it could be even purulent secretions may be present. So due to the chronic sinusitis which may be present, because usually chronic rhinosinusitis so is many a times part of this allergic rhinitis. There could be nasal pruritus, as I pointed out. The pruritus at the other areas can also be there. The associated symptoms, the ocular pruritus, the erythema, and the tearing, that the excessive tearing may be present, and the oral cavity and the oropharyngeal pruritus, and people can even have wheezing or the cough, reactive airway disease. So especially when associated with the asthma, so they can have these symptoms. Additional associated symptoms, the one can have hyposmia or anosmia, because there is a lot of edematous mucosa, and the nasal mucosa is congested, and there is blockage of the nasal cavity, and the odor, the materials for the sensation of the smell, they may not reach the olfactory area, so invariably resulting in hyposmia or anosmia. And the person so with allergic rhinitis and even can have snoring or sleep related sleep disordered breathing, so there can be obstructive sleep apnea as well. Oral congestion or the pruritus may be present. The sore throat, basically the sore throat is so because of so one there is the granular pharyngitis in these cases, or secondarily there could be sinusitis associated. So the secretions trickling into the throat, it can infect the oropharynx, so resulting in pharyngitis, in turn causing sore throat. The halitosis, so it's very commonly present when the sinusitis is associated. So that produces halitosis. There are some presence of the temporal patterns. So what are these? The symptoms, as I pointed out, so they are actually more intense during the early mornings. That's because of circadian variations. So even the asthma also, the symptoms are actually more intense early in the morning. The decrease in the symptoms throughout the day, so especially the presence of an indoor allergen, like exposure to house dust mite or animal dander, mold, or cockroaches. So initially early in the morning, the exposure to these things can be more, and as the day progresses, so the exposure to these agents is actually lesser, so it can actually reduce. The clear-cut worsening of the symptoms in outside environments can also, the probability of allergen to an outdoor allergen. So basically, when one is actually exposed to pollens or the molds, so the worsening of the symptoms is actually more when a person is actually exposed to pollen or even the molds. The physical examination, so if these are all non-specific, so especially in a child, so there could be elongated faces or the mouth breathing may be present. These things, because of the nasal obstruction, so these over a period of time, the face could be elongated, and the mouth breathing may be present. So if the eyes are actually examined, there is something called as the allergic shiners. So allergic shiners, so basically in my next slide, I will actually show this. These are the allergic shiners, also called as allergic phases or periorbital venous congestion. So I have seen many of the individuals having this pattern of, this pattern. So there is a typical periorbital edema, and they appear as dark circles under the eyes. Under the eyes, it can appear as dark circles, and it resembles the bruises or even the black eye. So looks like as if he's been punched by someone. So I have seen in many of these cases. Allergic shyness, basically it's caused by the pooling of the blood under the eyes due to the swelling of the tissue in the nasal cavities. So it's basically the pooling of the blood. So the venous congestion, so which actually causes these allergic shyness. And the Denny Morgan line. The Denny Morgan line is the line. So as one sees the line here, so this is actually the Denny Morgan line. And invariably, these Denny Morgan's lines are actually associated with about the atopic dermatitis in about 25% of the individuals. So these two are actually commonly associated, Denny Morgan lines, and again suggesting an allergic etiology. And dermatitis of the lids, outer eyelids, so may be present. The excessive lacrimation is present. Erythema and swelling of the bulbar conjunctiva. The bulbar conjunctiva, so it can be erythematous, and often the bulbar conjunctiva, it appears as the cobblestone papillae. So the cobblestone, I think you people have seen the cobblestones, the multiple stones which are actually stacked next to each other. So that's the appearance. So this conjunctivitis actually gives. The physical examination, when you examine the child, there could be allergic solutes, especially in children. So one might identify this sign. They try to clear off the secretions using their hands. Typically, this is called as the allergic solute. And over a period of time, because of this allergic solute, so what happens? So over the dorsum of the nose, these creases develop. So these transverse creases develop over a period of time. And once the nasal cavity is actually examined, so one can actually see the turbinates engorged, and the mucosa appears pale. And one can even see the allergic strands, so running across from the septum to the lateral nasal wall. The allergic strands can actually run. So here there is absolutely no space in the nasal cavity, and one can see these secretions. So this is a typical feature. So whenever a case of allergic rhinitis comes, this is what we actually normal see. This is the normal nose, how it should look like. The septum, this is the lateral nasal wall, this is the inferior turbinate. So this is how it actually should look like. But on the contrary, it looks like this. The nasal mucosa will be very pale. And the turbinate can actually get hypertrophied over a period of time in these cases. And if the allergic rhinitis is persistently, it is untreated, and if it is left untreated, so it can result in the nasal polyps, and characteristically it's the ethmoidal polyps which is present in these individuals. The inferior turbinate, this is actually the classification of the turbinate hypertrophy. It can be so 25%, it can be 25 to 50% of the nasal cavity may be occluded. Grade 3 is 50 to 75, and grade 4 is 75 to 100 nearly. So the turbinate hypertrophy can vary. This is the throat. Once the throat is actually examined, there can be halitosis due to the presence of the chronic rhinosinusitis and the postnasal drip. The high arched palate may be present. So because of just like in adenoid hypertrophy, how there is a high arched palate because of the persistent mouth breathing. In allergic rhinitis also there could be high arched palate. And many a times both these adenoids as well as the allergic rhinitis are actually coexistent together, because in individuals less than 13 or 14 years, the adenoid is also hypertrophied, and in addition to the allergies, both these put together can severely cause problem to the children. The malocclusion, again, because of the mouth breathing, the malocclusion, the teeth may not have, there could be crowding of the teeth, upper group of the teeth. So, but these features are characteristically seen in the adenoid hypertrophy. And the cobblestoning of the oropharyngeal wall. So once the oropharynx is examined, so there is cobblestoning. When once one examines the oropharynx, so if you see this cobblestone appearance, this is a cobblestone appearance, how typically the cobblestones appear. The same appearance, you get it in the pharyngeal wall. So once this is present, so it obviously says that the individual has allergic rhinitis and it's affecting the oropharynx as well. So this is a very important sign. And the postnasal discharge. So one may be able to see the postnasal discharge, especially if the chronic rhinosinusitis is associated with allergic rhinitis. The physical examination, there could be a midlear effusion, so that a tympanic membrane may be retracted. This is a normal ear. This is the secretory otitis media and the effusion, full-blown effusion. And the chest examination, if one examines, there could be wheezing associated, and diminished breath sounds could also be present. Excuse me. The skin, when there could be eczema, the urticaria, dermographism. So dermographism is when an individual tries to scratch over the skin, there is a marked erythema, and there could be marked erythema as well as the wheal and the flare reaction. So it will be very prominent. So one can actually see, so if whatever is actually under pressure, so whatever is written on the skin, so it becomes very prominent. So that is dermographism. It's basically common among the atopic individuals. The investigation, the hallmark of the allergic rhinitis is the evidence of specific IgE to a relevant antigen. So it's not just the IgE levels one has to see, and specifically we can actually look for a specific IgE levels is also possible nowadays. So the specific IgE could be to a particular agent. So it could be dust mites, it could be pollens or anything. So the identification of those levels is also possible nowadays. And one can even do skin prick test. So normally in all the individuals, it's not necessary that one needs to do skin prick test. Whatever the treatment these allergic rhinitis individuals needs, those cases in most of the individuals it's not required. Only in the individuals when the treatment, they are not responsive to the normal treatment what we actually give, in such individuals one may consider doing the skin prick test to identify what the person is allergic to. And as I pointed out, serum antigen specific IgE is nowadays preferred, increasingly preferred. The skin prick test, basically it is to confirm the diagnosis of the allergic rhinitis and to differentiate it from the non-allergic types of rhinitis. And it has got high sensitivity and specificity. It's about 80%. And it's more sensitive than the serum testing with added benefit of lower cost. So the cost is actually lower And so because of its high sensitivity and specificity, so one can actually go for this particular test, serum testing. Serum antigen specific IgE test. So basically the RAST method, radio allergosorbent test, is being preferred. And the safety profile of the serum antigen specific IgE is best of all available, and it's very easily available, and one can do it in major cities nowadays. And it's not influenced by any of the intake of the drugs or the skin disease, so that makes it even more preferable to do these serum antigen specific IgE. And the levels of these antigens or the IgE levels, it actually correlates with the severity of allergic rhinitis. If the allergic rhinitis is more severe, the levels of these specific IgE levels are very much elevated. So it is a very important test to be done. And one thing, the allergic rhinitis, it could be seasonal allergic rhinitis, or it can be perennial allergic rhinitis. The seasonal allergic rhinitis, only in some seasons, the individual can have the allergic rhinitis, especially during the pollen seasons. Individuals can have allergic rhinitis. So that is possible. So in some individuals throughout the year, a person so may be exposed, he may be exposed to the common dust, all as well as the dust mites. So a person may be exposed. So these the common dust, so it's present all the time, and so invariably person will have perennial allergic rhinitis. So throughout the year, the person can have the symptoms. This I don't want to complicate the things. So let's move on to the next slide. Allergic rhinitis, as I pointed out, so it's associated with multimorbidities. The asthma is spoken about, atopic dermatitis. The eosinophilic esophagitis. So this is a very important component. The eosinophilic esophagitis. Earlier, these cases of the eosinophilic esophagitis, they were all treated as having laryngopharyngeal reflux disease or GERD. But however, how to identify the eosinophilic esophagitis so if there are more number of the eosinophils, the mucosa needs to be taken out, and they needs to be it's basically by the lavage, and it needs to be examined under high power. So if one high power field, so if there are more than 10 eosinophils are actually found, so it's considered as eosinophilic esophagitis. The management of this eosinophilic esophagitis is actually very tricky, and it's basically there are a lot of the food allergens which are actually responsible for this eosinophilic esophagitis, and one needs to diagnose these entities. If a person is actually not responding to the conventional modes of the GERD, so that is so one indication that a person could be having is eosinophilic esophagitis. And the laryngopharyngeal reflux disease, which is treated for longer period of time, and the individual is not responding, one has to consider this, the eosinophilic esophagitis. The symptoms of this eosinophilic esophagitis is they can have persistent, the symptoms of GERD. It's almost the symptoms of the GERD. They can have a lot of vomiting and the burning sensation in the chest. So these are actually the symptoms of eosinophilic esophagitis. One needs to identify this entity. In my practice, I have come across 3 to 4 individuals who had this eosinophilic esophagitis. They were not responding to the treatment what we normally give for GERD. And these individuals, so once you actually treat them for about 2 to 3 months, and if they are not if the symptoms are actually persistent, so we need to think about this angle. The food allergy, again, so it's associated with allergic rhinitis. The conjunctivitis, I have told, the rhinosinusitis, turbinate hypertrophy, adenoid hypertrophy. The ear things I have already told. The GERD and the laryngitis. So they could be associated. They could be associated with allergic rhinitis. Next, the final important thing is the management of allergic rhinitis. The most important, many of these allergic rhinitis patients, they actually come to the clinic and they ask, they want a permanent treatment. So what I tell them is, you will get the permanent treatment, so provided the 100% exposure to the allergens is achieved. So I don't think it's possible in the present era where 100% of exposure to the allergens is actually possible. So what one has to remember is the avoidance of allergens is the most important component of the allergic rhinitis. The the treatment, yeah, the control of the allergens is the most important aspect of management of the allergic rhinitis. And then comes the pharmacotherapy and immunotherapy. So they are the next important next things. Allergen avoidance and environmental controls. Okay, so what all actually are important? So again, so all this is based on the level of the evidence. I think most of you know the level of the evidence. The level of the evidence, A is actually it's the RCTs, the meta-analysis of the RCTs rather. Then the B is the experimental studies. Based on the experimental studies, whatever evidence is available, we categorize it as B. Non-experimental studies. Non-experimental studies, basically, these are the observational studies. They actually constitute C. And D is actually the expert opinions. So they are actually the least level of the evidence. Okay, when we actually look at it, the for removal of the dust, the carpets, avoidance of the carpets, and remove the dust accumulating objects, whatever dust accumulating objects, so are actually removed. So this is actually the D. To how far extent these helps, but I have been advocating the people to remove the carpets. So it's a very common sense that the carpets they carry a lot of allergens. So it's a common sense, and they must work actually. So although the level of evidence is D, I feel these things, the avoidance of the removal of the carpets, and even the screens at home. So they must be removed. So because I have seen individual, in many homes where the screens are actually not cleaned, and even the carpets are actually not changed, invariably they carry a lot of allergens. The encase beddings, so they are actually encase beddings. So they are special non-allergic allergen the beddings which are available, and they have proved to be quite effective. And nowadays even online, so when one searches for these pillows as well as the bed coverings, they are all available. And the control of the mites, the bedding has to be washed so very frequently, so it is level B evidence. The vacuum, using the vacuum with HEPA filters, the cleaning, so again it's very good. And then the acaricides, basically against the mites. So it's even the against the cockroaches. The cockroaches also carry a lot of allergens. So that is important. The humidity control. The humidity control is very important, and basically the increased humidity is basically associated with the fungus or the mold formation in the at home. So the maintaining the humidity is very important. And one can see that is basically in the humid areas, there is a lot of fungus on the walls. So these could be potential allergens. They needs to be avoided. This is different levels of the evidence which is available. Allergen avoidance and the environmental controls, factors that facilitate the cockroach population. So the cockroaches are very bad, and so in consideration of the allergens, so what they actually carry, mainly the food and the water, the paths of the ingress, the microenvironments that can actually provide the shelter. All these are actually the they provide a conducive environment for the cockroach population to flourish, and uh, they should be seriously addressed. Okay, and but the level of evidence is actually D. The pesticides should be used judiciously and applied by a professional exterminator. So, okay, then the boric acid can is quite effective against the cockroaches, as per some of the reports. And reservoirs of the cockroach contaminants, they should be cleaned and removed. So this is very important. So here the level of the evidence is almost A. The reservoirs of cockroach contaminants, they should be cleaned as well as removed. So it's a very important point. The integrated pest management with a combination of interventions appear to be the most effective method for preventing and eliminating cockroach infestation. So this is based on this particular study. So where the different levels of the levels have been given, and this actually is very important. The reservoirs of the cockroach contaminants, they should be cleaned or removed. So it's a very important take home message, the last two. Allergen avoidance and environmental controls. The patient should be advised to consider removing the cat or dog from the environment. If they are suspected to be the strong agents responsible for allergic rhinitis, I think, so one may even have to consider removing the pets from the home. So that's very strongly been advised. And the other things I don't want to highlight. So these are all the measures. Basically, at the control of the pets. Okay, then coming finally to the pharmacotherapy. So where different group of the different agents are actually there to treat. So which among them is actually best? We can't say that any single one is actually best for allergic rhinitis. So it's basically based upon the severity of allergic rhinitis, and one may have to give a combination of these drugs in order to achieve good control. Omalizumab, still not in India. The cromolyn sodium, it's not that used. The antihistaminics, they play a very important role, and very commonly used in the treatment modalities. Leukotriene receptor antagonists like montelukast, very commonly used. So these two are very much important. The intranasal anticholinergics, not that much used. The decongestants, of course, whenever it's needed, on and off the decongestants, either the topical decongestants or the systemic decongestants can be used. The nasal saline, so to clear off the allergen load from the body, especially from the nasal passages, the nasal saline is increasingly being used. The corticosteroids, basically the topical steroids are increasingly used in the management of allergic rhinitis. And the combinations, the combination of these is what we actually follow based on it's custom made treatment for a particular patient. So that is the ultimate message. One has to do customization. The the first and the foremost thing to be advised is the avoidance of the allergens, and then the treatment has to be given. The patient says, so how long, so they have to keep using these medications. So all this I'll come to it later in the subsequent slides. So this is omalizumab. So although so in some of the countries it's being used, it's not that popular in India, and also it's not US FDA approved drug. Okay, I'll let me start the other ones actually. So rather than this, the again, the sodium so chromoglycate, the Mastel stabilizers, not that commonly used, in India. Okay, so let's come to the antihistaminics. So the antihistaminics, the oral H1 antihistaminics. So there are two, the earlier, the first generation antihistaminics were being used, and nowadays the second generation antihistaminics, so they are actually the ones which are preferred. So the earlier group of antihistaminics, so they were lipophilic and they readily used to cross the blood-brain barriers. Once these agents cross the blood-brain barrier, so they lead to sedation, drowsiness, fatigue, impaired concentration and memory, and anti-muscarinic effects. So these agents are not ideal, especially for someone who is actually going to school, colleges, or those who actually go to work. So this is not an ideal pharmacotherapy, and it's not recommended for allergic rhinitis. Whereas the second generation of the antihistaminics, they do not cross the blood-brain barrier, and even if they cross, it's very minimum amount or the negligible amount, and they have less CNS side effects. It's basically the second generation antihistaminics, so which are recommended for allergic rhinitis. Okay, so these are the second generation antihistaminic agents. So the Bilastin, so this is the new molecule which has come to India very recently, and the fexofenadine. So we have been we were using very commonly this fexofenadine for many years, and now this particular molecule, the Bilastin, has come into picture. So more or less, Bilastin as well as fexofenadine, they share many of the common properties. But however, there are some differences among them, the minor differences. So these are the other second generation antihistaminics, but levocetirizine, the cetirizine, desloratadine. So all these, again, the CNS penetration, if you look at it, so these three have the CNS penetration, and obviously individual to individual variation is there. If you take levocetirizine, some people will say there is no sedation. Some individuals will say there is sedation. So it varies from person to person. Whereas if you take Bilastin as well as fexofenadine, both of them do not have the CNS penetration. So both do not have the CNS penetration. And when the H1 receptors are actually considered, the selectivity is actually maximum with the Bilastin, as well as levocetirizine to some extent. So Bilastin is actually 3+. So it is very highly selective H1. It acts on the H1 receptors. Okay, the dry mouth, it's more with the desloratadine. Sedation, so absolutely the non-sedating, and even the fexofenadine also it's non-sedating. So whereas these three, levocetirizine, cetirizine, and desloratadine, so they have a significant amount of the sedation, relative a significant amount of the sedation. But the chlorpheniramine maleate, so it's a lot of sedation, and it's not the preferred one nowadays. The half-life, once one takes into account, just a single tablet of Bilastine or the fexofenadine is actually enough, because the half-life is as high as 14.5 hours here, 11 to 15 hours here. So whereas the half-life is different with levocetirizine, cetirizine, and desloratadine. The duration of action, so it's all of them, it's more than 24 hours here, and all of them nearly about 24 hours. The dosage, the Bilastine is about 10 to 20 mg OD, whereas fexofenadine, so 120 mg to 180 mg is commonly used. And then the onset of action, so onset of action, it's about 0.5 to 1 hour. This also about 1 hour. And the food interaction, so this is one of the things which so maybe one can see that, so this is this needs to be taken on the empty stomach. So either the Bilastine needs to be taken half an hour before the food, or if one takes the food 1 hour after the food, person has to take it. Okay. In elderly individuals, Bilastine as well as the fexofenadine, so there is no dose adjustment needed, and it can be safely given to the elderly individuals. So whereas when these agents are being considered, so when you want to consider these, so slightly, so you have to be careful in the renal impaired patients. Hepatic impairment, these do not have anything. And in concomitant renal impairment associated with the hepatic impairment, so one needs to be careful with these two drugs, levocetirizine as well as cetirizine. And desloratadine, definitely, yes, hepatic impairment is there. So one needs to be very careful when giving desloratadine in hepatic impairment individuals. The renal impairment, so there is no need to alter the dosages, and Bilastine and fexofenadine, so it can be safely given to these individuals. And drivers, pilots, some professions, they require a very good antihistaminic to be given, especially the drivers, the pilots, the machine workers. So you can't afford to give a sedative antihistaminic to these professions. And also the school going children. So the school going children are actually sleeping in the school. There is no point. They go to school, they sleep, and they come back home. So it's important that these individuals are not given the sedative antihistaminics. It's not just the sleep, but even there could be serious consequences. So for the machine workers, he can injure his hand. The pilots, both his life as well as the other's life is at risk. So it's very important that the profession is thoroughly asked when you are actually treating these individuals. When there is concomitant disease like asthma and CVD, so the Bilastine as well as fexofenadine, they're actually quite safe. This is coronary vascular disease. The other allergies, if a person has urticarias, conjunctivitis, again, so these are the two things, so which are actually preferred. Of course, these also can be given. So, but these are the preferred ones. Okay, the indication for rhinoconjunctivitis. So this one, Bilastine, is preferred for rhinoconjunctivitis, and even the cetirizine can also be given. The allergic rhinitis, so all of them they can be used. Indications for urticaria, so all of them can be used in urticarias. The pediatric indication, so the one negative point with Bilastine is the safety is not proved in individuals less than 2 years. One needs to be quite careful when the Bilastine is, it's not indicated for less than 2 years. The pregnancy and the lactation, so there is very limited data of Bilastine, and So these are the important things. So one needs to know. I think most of the important points actually I have covered among these tables. Okay. Leukotriene receptor antagonist like the montelukast is so one thing so which is increasingly used, and the dosage of it so mainly if it is children, so it's available in the syrup form as well as in tablet form, so 4 mg or 5 mg tablets are available, and in case of the adults 10 mg tablets are commonly available. So these montelukast tablets, they are quite safer, and they can be used for a longer period of time. So a very important component of managing the allergic rhinitis, the montelukast. Of course, there are other drugs also, but the montelukast is increasingly preferred, and I have hardly seen the other tablets. I have not personally used the other tablets. It's montelukast, which is invariably used. Need to address small peripheral airways and the inflammation, and it's not just the as I pointed out, when asthma is associated, the asthma needs to be treated, and one may have to give a reference to the pulmonologist or a physician in order to treat asthma. So both the asthma as well as allergic rhinitis, they needs to be treated parallelly. It's very important, and depending upon so what needs to be given, so it may be inhaled corticosteroids may have to be given for asthma. So those things have to be kept in mind, or even the inhaled so one may have to be given the bronchodilators as well. So it depends from individual to individual, and it's important that both asthma as well as allergic rhinitis are parallelly treated. I'm not going into the minute aspects of it. The one important thing about the montelukast, the specific feature of the montelukast is it blocks the bronchoconstriction and the mucus secretions, and it's alternative to inhaled steroids in mild persistent asthma. So one can even prefer montelukast instead of giving inhaled steroids in mild variant of asthma. And there is an addictive effect with inhaled corticosteroids, especially in patients with severe bronchial asthma. So there is an addictive effect. And in such individuals, one may consider giving montelukast either intermittently, basically intermittently if it is used, it's better. And montelukast, it helps the reduction in dose whenever there is a reduction in the dosage of oral or the inhaled beta 2 antagonist drugs. So in those cases also you can actually substitute montelukast. So these are actually and when the leukotriene antagonists are actually used, it may lead to decrease in the doses of inhaled steroids by 400 to 600 micrograms. That is one of the advantages when leukotriene is actually used along with the inhaled steroids. So one can actually reduce the dosage of the inhaled steroids. That is one of the advantages of using the montelukast. Intranasal and anticholinergics, not so not very popular, and not being although it's used in many parts. So I have not used this in intranasal anticholinergics, and I don't want to deal with it so too much. The decongestants, as a part of the substitutive treatment for symptomatic treatment of allergic rhinitis, these decongestants can be used, either the topical or the oral decongestants can be used. The oral decongestants which are commonly available are the pseudoephedrine hydrochloride and phenylephrine, whereas the topical agents which are available are xylometazoline and oxymetazoline. One needs to be very, very choosy when we are actually giving xylometazoline and oxymetazoline. People are, abusing this drug in the sense, so they are actually using these drugs continuously the topical decongestants continuously for years together, and they come to us. When we examine them, so invariably they will have rhinitis medicamentosa, a condition due to the prolonged usage of the topical decongestants that terminates. What happens initially, so when these decongestants are given, what happens, the turbinates actually, they decongest, and the airway is relieved. But over a period of time, with the continuous usage of more than 3 weeks, the turbinates, rather than decongesting, so starts to hypertrophy, and it leads to a condition. So it's almost irreversible. It can even reach the irreversible stage, and the surgery may be the option in the late stages of rhinitis medicamentosa if they don't do well with topical steroids. So that is one of the reasons, the xylometazoline and oxymetazoline, they have to be used only when there is absolute necessity. Patient says is not able to sleep at all. So only in some days he may be advised to use it. But the other treatment is very important. Specific treatment of allergic rhinitis is important. And the oral decongestants, they are also available, and one can give the oral decongestants as well to the individual. The nasal saline, as I pointed out, can be used because it removes the mucus as well as the inflammatory mediators. That's one of the mechanisms. The second thing is it's going to dilute the antigen. So that's a very important thing, what it actually does. Nasal saline irrigation can be advised basically to dilute the antigen, and the mucociliary clearance is increased whenever the saline is used. The mucociliary clearance is increased, and the secretions, they rapidly get cleared off. They go to the nasopharynx and down, and it has proven benefits in many of the studies, both in adults as well as children. And also the cost of this nasal saline is actually very low, so this also can be used. Next is the intranasal corticosteroids. So very important drug, specific drug for allergic rhinitis. And this is being so increasingly used. And so this is one of the mainstay of management of allergic rhinitis, the intranasal corticosteroids. Okay, this is effective for all the nasal symptoms, may also benefit the ocular symptoms through nasoocular reflex. And especially if the ocular symptoms are there, so I normally prefer azilastin, the combination steroids, so that the ocular symptoms are also taken care of. The onset of the action of the intranasal corticosteroids is 3 hours up to 60 hours after the first dose. So the maximum effect of the intranasal corticosteroids can last up to 2 weeks. And there are, okay, all these, okay, whenever the asthma is associated, even it improves asthma control, that the intranasal corticosteroids, even it improves the asthma control as well. So it's important that this is used in cases of allergic rhinitis. I'll come to the different, the mild and moderate, how they are managed at the end. However, some people complain of dryness. So if there is any, especially if there is a deviated nasal septum, and on that particular side, if a patient is actually using the spray, they can have the epistaxis as well, a little bit of the epistaxis. And some people even complain of burning sensation after using the topical steroids. Rarely individual can have septal perforation, very, very rare. I have not come across any individuals after using the intranasal corticosteroids having septal perforations. And there is no evidence of nasal mucosal atrophy. So atrophy also I have not come across. The systemic absorption of these intranasal corticosteroids is so nearly negligible. So many of my patients, they after using after the moment I say you need to take the steroids, so they say the steroids are bad and you're advocating it. So that's the thing many patients are concerned about. So you need to explain them that the intranasal corticosteroids, the systemic absorption is nearly negligible and it can be used. Unlike the systemic corticosteroids, the complications like the topical corticosteroids that does not affect the ocular pressure, it does not lead to glaucoma, the lens opacity, or the cataract formation. So all these are very lesser. So the normally what we actually use is fluticasone and the mometasone. So these are increasingly used, and to a lesser extent the budesonide. So these are the ones which we normally use. And the long-term growth is let me not go into this. So this is basically it's a stadiometry growth velocity effect size for intranasal steroids. So I haven't gone through this slide in detail, so let's not go through this. The systemic availability. So this is a very important slide. The systemic bioavailability of intranasal steroids. So here, so you can see that the systemic absorption when the intranasal corticosteroids are actually given, the absorption percentage is actually very lesser with fluticasone furoate, the fluticasone propionate, and mometasone. So it's very lesser with these three. Whereas if you take budesonide, so it's quite quite an amount which enters into the systemic circulation, and even the beclomethasone also, and triamcinolone, as well as the flunisolide. So all these things they enter the systemic circulation significantly. That's one of the reasons. So these are the agents which are normally preferred, intranasal steroids. Okay, the fluticasone propionate, the normally approved age is 4 years. So 4 years is the normally approved age. Whereas, if you want to start from 2 years itself, so one can actually prefer fluticasone furoate or the mometasone. So I've been using the mometasone. So not just in children, it is safer, but also in the pregnancy as well as lactation. So mometasone is actually very safer compared to the other counterparts. So these nasal corticosteroids, so the symptom wise, if you take it, so it has got a very good effect. So almost 3+, 3+, and 2+ for eyes, rhinorrhea, congestion, nasal congestion, itching, sneezing. So all these things are actually well taken care of by nasal corticosteroids. So whereas if the antihistaminics oral are actually given, so it will not have that much of an effect on the congestion, and however sneezing and itching to very good effect, whereas sneezing to a lesser extent. Okay, this is the area recommendation. So for the management of allergic rhinitis. So this is a mild, then moderate to severe, mild persistent, and moderate severe persistent. So, so this is a very important thing. If it's mild intermittent, so one can think of giving allergen or irritant avoidance. So these measures so can be considered in these individuals. So let me come to the intranasal corticosteroids. So moderate to severe, the mild persistent as well as moderately severe persistent, the intranasal steroids is very much effective for this. Okay, and the local chromones also they have some role in these three varieties. So whereas the oral or local non-sedative H1 blockers, so they are actually useful in all these four stages, H1 antihistaminics. So all these four varieties of the disease that is useful. Whereas intranasal steroids mainly moderate to severe, intermittent and onwards. If it is a persistent mild variety or even moderate to severe persistent variety, the intranasal steroid is actually the treatment of choice. And the nasal decongestants in all these four stages, at different points of time they may have to use the decongestants. As I pointed out, it's basically the tailor-made approach for each individual. So what you have to give, and so you have to think about giving a particular drug. Okay. And immunotherapy, of course, mild, persistent, or moderately severe cases. So when these drugs are not that much effective, one can actually go for immunotherapy. Hardly any of my patients have actually gone for immunotherapy. One or two individuals, they tried considering immunotherapy. This is more or less the same thing. So what actually I have covered, I will not be going again. So this is actually the newer classification and the intermittent and the persistent symptoms. What I have spoken about. So the treatment so doesn't it remains more or less the same thing. And if there is ocular symptoms, as I pointed out, the intranasal steroids, they work, as well as the azilastin. So maybe added with the combination of the intranasal steroids with azilastin may have to be considered if conjunctivitis is there. Or topical antihistaminics can also be considered if there is conjunctivitis. Okay, this okay, about the asthma. Okay. The immunotherapy, so immunotherapy is altogether so a different entity, and it's for a different day. And I think so I have consumed so more time, so I have taken more than 1 hour. So I'll not be only the indications, IgE mediated disease, the limited spectrum allergies. So the one so we cannot avoid the allergens, not adequately controlled with the medications. Those are the individuals where the immunotherapy have to be considered. Okay. So with this, I would like to, end my presentation. And thanks for your patient listening. Thanks a lot. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take it up.
Thank you, Manjunath sir, for this wonderful ECME, wonderful presentation, and highlighting all the important aspects related to allergic rhinitis. We have few questions in the Q&A box, sir. I will read it for you. Uh, the first question is from Dr. Akshay. He's asking, in our OPD, lots of patients will be coming with gross septal deviation.
Yeah.
So associated with AR, should we operate such patients?
It actually depends. All cases with deviation so may not require the surgery. But however, so if the deviation is considerable, and if they are associated with allergy, the first and the foremost thing is, so one has to consider giving these medications. So whatever is the standard protocol of management for the allergic rhinitis. So in spite of that, if the septal deviation is actually contributing to the nasal obstruction in a significant way, so one can do diagnostic nasal endoscopy and subsequently considered for septal correction. But septal correction alone is not the treatment. So one has to bear that in mind.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Yeah. Okay. Sir, one more question from Dr. Reshma. What about DEC treatment, sir?
Diethyl carbamazepine. I have used in so a lot of patients, especially for the eosinophilia. So eosinophilia is a very important thing, especially in the Asian population. So few literature they say that the eosinophilia. So when compared to the Americans or the Europeans, the eosinophilia is a very prominent aspect. So with the Asian population. And so if the eosinophilia is, I'm actually going to do investigate the patient for the eosinophils. And sometimes I have come across individuals who have the absolute eosinophil count. The absolute eosinophil count normally is up to 450. And I have seen individuals where the eosinophil count has gone more than 1000 or 1500 also. So in such individuals, I have actually given this diethyl carbamazepine, and the acute symptom wise, it actually acts well. So you can consider the DEC for such individuals.
Uh, it
Yeah,
is from
please.
some anonymous attendees. He is asking, can we assure patient that allergy can be curable?
Yeah, as I told you, allergy is not curable, but basically it needs to be controlled. So I tell the patient, if you achieve 100% of the allergen avoidance, so it's cured. So, as you know very well, so it's not possible to control the allergy 100%. So that is one of the reasons these medications. So they have to be on and off. The patient needs to be on medications on and off. So along with the allergen avoidance. So allergen avoidance, so if the allergen avoidance is very good, a person can actually achieve about the control to about 90%. So it is possible. And of course, so now with the corona, a lot of people are actually using the mask, and that has considerably reduced the allergic rhinitis as well as asthma significantly if you go through the studies. So it's not possible, and we are not living in an ideal world, and we have to accept that 100% avoidance of the allergens is not possible.
Very rightly said, sir. One more question. Is saline nasal wash and steam inhalation helpful in prevention of allergic rhinitis?
Yeah, basically the saline wash, as I pointed out, so it's very much useful in reducing the allergen dosage. So whatever allergens what we actually inhale, so they will be there on the nasal mucosa. So if we are able to wash it, so 1 to 2 times, if we are able to wash it, so especially after going outside and coming home, so it's going to reduce the concentration of the allergen, and that is a very good thing one can consider in allergic rhinitis.
Dr. George Johnson, he is asking, so skin prick test or intradermal test, which is more sensitive in allergic rhinitis?
Intradermal test, I haven't done, so I have no idea about the intradermal test. Basically, the skin prick test is the one so which is increasingly done, and basically to detect the type of the allergen. So the intradermal test, I have not much of an experience with it.
One more question we have, sir, how can you differentiate allergic rhinitis from other rhinitis?
Yeah, it's basically based on the history and the examination things, whatever I actually presented. So based on the history, recurrent episodes of the sneezing, watery nasal discharge, if the person is having, so it strongly suggests that a person is having allergy. In addition to that, the pruritus, as I told you, so they could be present. The ocular symptoms may be there. And when you examine, so I showed in the picture the how the allergic rhinitis nasal cavity looks like. Basically, the pale looking turbinate, the mucosa, the strands of the the mucus allergen strands, so which is there in the nasal cavity. So that's if they are present, and the watery secretions, so you have to say that it is allergic rhinitis. The allergic rhinitis itself over a period of time, so it can result in chronic rhinosinusitis. In such individuals, both the allergic rhinitis as well as chronic rhinosinusitis may be present in the same individual. So in such individuals, the secretion, so when you examine the nasal cavity, it is actually more mucoid. Those individuals, they will be having a lot of postnasal drip. The postnasal drip and subsequently patient will have halitosis. So these are the, and patient can even have headache. So headache is a very important symptom of chronic rhinosinusitis. So basically, the history as well as the examination, it clinches whether the person is having only allergic rhinitis or a combination of allergic rhinitis or chronic rhinosinusitis, or if a person is having only non-allergic rhinitis. So those things can be diagnosed.
So, I think Dr. Sindhu, she's asking, does steam inhalation help? I think this has already been answered.
Yeah, of course, the steam inhalation, so also it helps in the same manner as that of the saline nasal wash. So that also can be considered, but so I would prefer the saline nasal wash over the steam inhalation for clearance of the allergens from the nasal mucosa.
Question is, sir, how to differentiate vasomotor rhinitis from allergic rhinitis?
So vasomotor rhinitis, basically, so they will not have allergic features when allergic features, and vasomotor rhinitis specifically, so the history is very important in the vasomotor rhinitis. So it may be, so the nasal obstruction can aggravate enormously when a person actually lies down, and if a person exercises, suddenly there is a decongestion. So this is very prominent in vasomotor rhinitis because of the autonomic activity. And in the pregnancy also, so in the pregnancy as well as in the lactation also, the significantly patient will have the nasal obstruction, so because of the engorgement of the turbinates. So in the vasomotor rhinitis, the individuals will not have on examination, they will not have the signs which I told for allergic rhinitis. So basically in vasomotor rhinitis, they will have an enlarged turbinates is as a sign.
One last question, anonymous attendee is asking, sir, could you please explain choice of treatment for mild and moderate case? Again, I don't think so that we have so much time. In brief, sir, can you just go through if possible?
Yeah, the mild cases, so as I pointed out, so the mild cases, so one can actually, there is no necessity for intranasal steroids. So whereas in mild persistent case, in the mild persistent allergic rhinitis, the intranasal steroids will be very useful. So whereas mild intermittent, so one can actually go manage with just H1 blockers, antihistaminics, or even the nasal decongestants and allergen and irritant avoidance. So whereas the moderate to severe intermittent cases, so those are the cases where intranasal steroids are very much important, and one has to give the intranasal steroids. Along with that, the montelukast, so as well as the antihistaminics, so on and off, can be given to moderate to severe cases, and as well as in the mild persistent cases.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Manjunath sir, for taking all these questions and clearing the doubts of doctors. At last, any concluding remark before we give it to Sharath sir?
Okay, sir. Thanks a lot, sir, Dr. Manjunath, sir. It was very, very informative and most
Thank you.
wonderful session, sir. All our queries you have addressed, sir. You have covered everything, sir. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sharath. Once again, so thanks a lot for taking so much of interest, and I appreciate all the audience who are there, both off screen as well as the online. And so it's a huge boost so for us to conduct similar programs in the future as well. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot,
Thank you, sir.
one and all.
Thank you.
And I would also like to thank the RPG Life Sciences, who have really helped us in organizing this program in a very short period of time. So they were dynamic, and so they coordinated both at Hubli as well as at Gadag. I thank them and very much appreciate their concern for organizing the academic programs. Thanks a lot to them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Like, sir, like now, Dr. George will address the vote of thanks. 1 minute, sir.
Yeah.
The organizing team, my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. My thoughts with lots of gratitude and respect for our distinguished chief guest, Dr. Manjunath sir, for not only sparing his invaluable time for us to grace this occasion, but also for enlightening us, for clearing our concepts and enhancing our understanding pertaining to the topic contemporary management of allergic rhinitis. You have indeed put best of all your efforts, sir, to make this event unforgettable. We really owe you a lot, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
The CME would have been impossible without the support of RPG Life Sciences, who are the sponsors of this online CME. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. On behalf of entire team of RPG Life Sciences, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to Gadag Institute of Medicine, and especially to Dr. Manjunath, sir, for being part of this CME as a chief speaker. And we also would like to thank Dr. Sarat Babu for wonderfully organizing this ECME. Also, thanks to all the doctors who have joined us for this ECME. The edited YouTube link and the video would be shared with all of you once it is approved by Manjunath sir. So once it is approved, we can share it with you. Till the next time we meet, on behalf of entire team of RPG Life Sciences, stay safe, take care, and goodbye. Thank you.